All right, let's get started. So this is, as I said, the Zoom session for your essay in rural health. The plan for this session is that I'll go through the essay instructions with you. And as I do that, I'll go through and give you some tips and tricks about how to tackle some of those sections of the essay and talk a little bit about what the expectations are, the things that we'll be looking for when we're assessing these. As I say, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask if there's something that you want me to expand on or seek some clarification around, further clarification. And the other thing I'll do is I will go through the, briefly go through the marking rubric with you, and there'll be opportunity, as I say, for you guys to ask questions as we go through. I'll try to wrap this up at about 1:45, because I know that some of you will probably have class at 12, and I've also got other things happening at 12 o'clock. So I'll just open up the essay guide, and as I say, we'll go through and have a look at the assignment. So the first thing we'll do is just talk about the basics around, you know, weightings, etc. So as I said, this is a essay worth 40% of your overall mark for the subject. So it's quite a heavy weighting for this piece of work. And so with that comes the expectation that students have engaged with material, that they have done quite a bit of research and some planning in order to do really well in an assignment worth this much. It is 1,800 words, and you always have plus or minus 10% of that word count. I've had a few questions around things like, are quotes included, in-text references included, and the answer is no. I'll talk a little bit more about using quotes a little bit later on in the session. So that 1,800 words doesn't include your in-text referencing and doesn't include short quotes. It is due on Monday, the 2nd of September, and just note that it's due at 12 noon. Obviously, being an online subject, it'll be submitted via LMS, and it will go through Turnitin. So this assignment, what we've done for you is given you obviously the topic, but we've also put together a fairly comprehensive essay guide to help you to plan for this assignment. So you can see that we've got tips here around writing and expectations. I'm not going to go through a lot of that today in terms of the writing tips, but that information is there for you to refer to. And of course, there are other academic skills support that's available through the library, such as the PLAs. There are learning advisors, there's the student learning website that you can refer to. So you've got lots of support around academic writing and academic referencing. There's a couple of you who are not on mute, and we can hear some background.
Yeah, I can't hear it though.
Can you please just make sure that you're on mute? All right, the topic. Let's talk about the topic. So your task is to produce an essay which looks at the social determinants and the implications of remoteness on health. And so we've been doing a little bit of work with you around looking at and coming up with explanations of why there might be differences in morbidity and mortality in rural and remote areas, and looking at health status differences. There's some of you who are still not on mute. Could you please just ask that you are, because I'm getting quite a bit of feedback and noise. So you've been looking at, you know, what the health status of rural and remote communities. You've been doing a bit of work around trying to understand what do we mean when we're talking about rural and remote. So this essay is about bringing that together into a comprehensive case study of a particular remote community. So what you need to do for this essay is to select a remote community that is an RA4 community, and you'll use that as a case study throughout your entire essay. And then what you'll do is you'll use a public health approach to discuss the implications of remoteness of health for this particular community. And then you'll detail and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of one health promotion initiative within that community. So some of the questions that I get asked are we going to provide you with a list of RA4 communities? And the answer is no. That if you look at the marking rubric, you'll see that under the criteria for remote community, that you're actually being assessed on your ability to identify an appropriate community. So if you're not sure what an RA4 community is, or how to find one, then you'll need to go back to the week 2 material where we asked you to search your postcode to see what its classification was. So refer back to week 2. So in your essay, that's one thing you need to do is obviously identify the community. The next part is around looking at the implications, the health issues of this community, looking at particular characteristics of this community, and trying to make sense of what are some of the social determinants that are at play here. So I've put together some tips that I'll go through with you around how to tackle these particular parts of that essay. So as I said, the first thing you need to do is define the geographic location. So you can do this in your introduction. So you need to define, for example, what do we mean by classification systems? How do we define remoteness? You might want to include a definition of what the ASGS is and what RA4 might mean. So in your introduction, you need to define and identify that community, and you might want to include some other key terms as you see applicable. Your introduction should also make the purpose of your essay clear. So what we would be looking for in that introduction is one, that obviously your community is identified, but also that you outline, for example, maybe some of the health implications or determinants that you're going to examine, and that you also introduce the particular health promotion initiative that you're going to focus on in this essay as well. I'll talk shortly a little bit about introductions and conclusions and give you some tips around how to write those. The topic, so that's your introduction. When you start drilling down into the body of your assignment, we are talking here about social determinants, and there's a whole range of social determinants that you could be looking at. We're not talking just about access or lack of access to health services. We know that that's an issue in rural and remote communities, but what we're interested in is what are some of the other social determinants that might be at play for your community in focus. That might be things like looking at employment and unemployment. It might be looking at things like housing. It might be looking at things like transport and transport infrastructure, so things like access to public transport, for example. It might be looking at some other environmental factors or particular cultural factors. It might be looking at things like you might want to look at a specific, subpopulation group. So, for example, looking at early life. We know that early life is recognised as one of the key 10 social determinants of health. So there's a whole range of determinants other than just access or lack of access that you could look at. There is also, you might look at education, for example. You might want to look at, in your community, what are the opportunities for education. You could use something like the ABS census data to have a look at things like how many people in that community have completed high school education. ABS census data provides a breakdown of school completion. It looks at levels of completion, so people who have completed high school, people who have completed undergraduate, postgraduate, and other forms of education. So you can use that evidence to demonstrate what might be happening in that local community. When you're looking at health and what is different about a remote location, we want you to be doing some comparisons to rural and urban locations. So, for example, you might look at, particular health conditions that are more evident in that particular community, and making some comparisons between that remote community and perhaps other rural or urban population groups. You might want to compare, for example, maybe one of the things that's evident in this community is the rates of type 2 diabetes. And you might want to compare that to what that looks like against state or even national data. So we want you to draw on evidence and really highlight what this might mean for that particular remote community compared to other rural or urban locations. Okay. We don't want you focusing just on negative health aspects. We want you, this should be a balanced essay. So we also want you to think about, what are the benefits of remoteness? How does living in a remote community actually enhance people's health and well-being? And so you might want to look at things like, social capital or social connectedness, for example. You might want to look at some cultural factors that actually enhance, rural and remote health, for example. You'll need to consider characteristics of the remote community that you've selected. So, for example, you could look at and provide a description of the types of services that are available, not necessarily, health or medical services, but looking at what other types of services, are existing within that community. So, as I mentioned before, something like, public transport. It might be in terms of what schooling or education opportunities are available. You could look at the social aspects, so thinking about, as I said, that social capital, social connectedness. What are the opportunities that exist there? You could look at the economy. So, for example, are there particular industries that particular community is reliant upon as a major source of income for that community, whether that be something like mining or agriculture or even tourism, or a combination of those. If you're talking about, say, employment rates, you could provide some of the census data around, well, here's the current employment versus the current unemployment rate, and here are the major industries, that exist within this population where people are being employed. And also looking at the population as well. So you might obviously look at, what is the current population, but also breaking that down into some subpopulation groups. Is there a subpopulation group that's, worth noting in that community, such as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples? It might be that there's a significant migrant population or refugee population. It may be an ageing population. And so what you could do, if you notice that in your research, is that might become a focus for your entire essay. So you might want to look at, older people, for example, and focus on the health issues experienced by older people in that community, the social determinants experienced by older people, and then looking at a health promotion initiative in that community for older people. It's up to you whether you want to narrow it down or keep it broad. So the parameters of the essay are entirely up to you. You just need to make that clear in the purpose of your essay, so back in your introduction. Okay. Where do you find some of this information? So as I've mentioned, there's obviously the ABS census data. And so the most recent census was back in 2016. So we would be expecting you to be using that data. There's often local councils will have community profiles, and in those profiles they'll have information about the population size. They'll have a breakdown of subgroups, age, sex, etc. They'll often have information around areas of employment, unemployment rates. So have a look at, once you've identified your community, go and have a look at the local council's website to see if they've got some of that information. If you're looking at some of the health services that exist within a community, sometimes those services will have population data or other information around social determinants and evidence that you can draw on. There is, of course, if you're wanting to make some comparisons between your population group and, say, state or national, you could look at state departments of health and also the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, have extensive information and evidence on a whole range of health issues and determinants. The latest report is the Australia's Health Report for 2018, which provides up-to-date evidence around major health issues and around determinants. And it even has a component specific to rural and remote, so you could look at that. You could look at Google Scholar, of course. I wouldn't rule out using Google Scholar to have a look at, for information around remote communities, around determinants of health, for example. So there's lots of places that you can find this information. The other thing just to remember is that there are also not-for-profit organisations in a lot of these communities. So, organisations like, whether it be women's health services or neighbourhood houses, for example. There are also charities and faith-based organisations that you could look at that might have useful information. They can also be good for trying to identify a health promotion initiative as well. So there's also, in this country, we have an extensive network of what are called primary health networks. And these primary health networks, collect a lot of population data within their geographic location. So I think there's 31 of those networks across Australia. So all of these remote communities will sit under one of those networks. So if you identify your community, have a look to see if you can identify which primary health network it sits within, and then go and have a look at their website and see if you can find some population data that you can use, but also have a look at what they might be doing in terms of health promotion work. So you might get an idea for an initiative from them. And also look at state government as well. Again, you'll get population data, you'll get data on determinants, and you might also come across an initiative that's happening at a state level that your particular remote community might be a recipient of, at that level as well. All right, so that's the characteristics of the community discussion around determinants. Just one other thing that I just want to touch on in relation to determinants. So the focus is on social determinants. You can look at environmental, you can look at political, economic and cultural determinants, that's absolutely fine. What we don't want to see, though, is a discussion based entirely around behavioural or lifestyle determinants. If you're just focusing on behavioural and lifestyle determinants, you're missing out on the underlying causes of those particular behaviours. So you're not capturing what is really going on in terms of what's contributing to good or poor health within that remote community. When we look at the marking guide, you'll see that if your essay is entirely focused on education, behaviour, or focusing just on increasing services, then you're not going to do well in this particular assignment. Okay, so this is about looking at those underlying system structures, social determinants that are impacting on remote health both positively and negatively. All right, so that's the middle section of your essay. The other part of your essay that we're asking you to look at is a health promotion initiative. And so you do need to look at a recent initiative. It needs to be something that that people in that community are recipients of or are participants of. So we're looking at, it could be an initiative that is currently being implemented within that community, or it could be something that has been implemented within about the last 5 years, okay? We want you to discuss the strengths and the weaknesses of this. So again, we're looking for a balanced discussion. So we don't want you looking at just the strengths or just the limitations of it. What we want to see is that, because with any program, there are always strengths and limitations. When you're talking about the strengths and the limitations, we want you to be linking that back to the previous discussion points within your essay. So, for example, if you're looking at the strengths of of this particular initiative, you should be linking it back to a public health approach. So, for example, linking it back to how it is perhaps addressing a particular social or environmental or economic determinant within that community, a determinant that you have discussed and provided some evidence on earlier in your essay. You could also link it to, again, if you're thinking about a public health approach, linking it to, is this a program that is, the strength of it is that it's focused on primary prevention, or maybe the weakness is that this, particular intervention or initiative is really only focusing on behavioural interventions and isn't fully recognising the social or environmental determinants that are existing within a particular community. So we want to see internal logic. So the health issues that you talk about need to relate to the social determinants. The health promotion initiative needs to relate to those other factors that you've already talked about. So you wouldn't want to pick something, and so for example, if you've looked at rates of cardiovascular disease and some of the underlying determinants of that, you then wouldn't have a health promotion initiative that was addressing, diabetes, for example. Okay, so there's got to be that internal logic throughout your essay. You do need to provide a brief description of the health promotion initiative, so don't just launch into strengths and weaknesses. Give us a brief outline of the initiative. What are the aims? What are the objectives? What are they doing in terms of strategies? Okay. So give us enough detail to get a sense of what that particular initiative is trying to do and how they're doing it before you discuss the strengths and the limitations. Okay. You may need to, you'll see here that I've made a comment around that you might need to find some evaluations. So if it's a program or an initiative that's been completed, there may be existing evaluations and you can draw on the evaluations of those initiatives to help inform the strengths and the weaknesses, that discussion. If your program or initiative is a current one, you may not have evaluations to draw upon for that particular initiative. So what I would recommend is that rather than just making up some random, strengths or weaknesses, go and have a look at some similar programs and have a look at the evaluations that might have been done on those. Have a look at the strengths and the weaknesses that they've identified, and you may be able to connect that back to your particular health initiative. Okay, so you will need to do a little bit of research and a bit of gain a bit of an understanding about evaluation and strengths and limitations of health promotion initiatives more broadly to then make that connection. All right. The last bit is so that's the body of your essay. The last bit is your conclusion. So in your conclusion, as you would with any essay, you'd provide a bit of a summary about the key points that you have addressed. But what we also want to see in your assignment is the so what factor. And so the so what factor in all of this is a statement about the implications of remoteness on health. What does it mean to live in a remote community, and what impact does that have on people's health and well-being, positively and or negatively? And then what recommendations would you make about working to promote health and prevent illness in this remote location based on the health issues that you've identified, based on the social determinants that are at play, and based on that health promotion initiative that you've looked at. So it's an opportunity to come back and again connect all three components of your essay to make some sort of recommendation around health promotion and illness prevention. Okay. I'll just quickly jump to, can you see that PowerPoint? Someone just let me know you can see that?
No.
No, okay, I'll just reshare my screen. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Great. So this here is just a little, so if you're trying to think about your introduction and your conclusion, a great way to think about them is using what's called a funnel approach. So in your introduction, you want to start off really broad. So this is where you might talk about, for example, defining what we mean by remote. You might want to define or explain what the ASGS classification system is. But you want to use, something that'll grab the reader's attention. Then as you start to narrow into the funnel, you can give us an explanation of the topic for the essay. So you're looking at about maybe 3 sentences for that. So that's, for example, that you're going to look at this particular community, you're going to look at, the social determinants of health, and you can be specific about which ones you're going to look at, and what your health promotion initiative will be. And then you can talk a little bit about, narrow that down into that you're going to, combine all of these things to look at the implications for remote health. Okay, so that's drilling down in your introduction to specifically what you're going to be talking about. Your conclusion is almost the reverse of that. So you want to restate the thesis. So basically, what have you been looking at? So again, it's that this essay has examined, the implication of remoteness on X community. Then you reconfirm your argument. So this is where you summarize again in about 3 sentences what you've talked about. Okay. And then that bit at the end where we really broaden it out is your so what factor. So this is where you can talk about that statement around the implications of remoteness on people's health and provide your recommendations linking those 3 sections together. Okay. Some other tips just in terms of the academic writing. Often what we see in essays, particularly essays like this one, is the use of a lot of emotive language. So all academic writing, particularly academic essays, should be free of emotion. So we want to avoid using emotive language like staggering rates, drastic measures, we're combating, diabetes, for example, or the rates of unemployment are alarmingly high. We don't want to use that sort of language. We want to remain objective. We just talk about, for example, the rates of unemployment are this. So we want to be factual rather than emotive. The use of capital letters, so I often see the misuse of those. So for example, the World Health Organization is always in all capitals, the W, the H and the O. And organisation always has a Z because this is a proper noun. So you can see, there's some examples of how we, don't present that particular proper noun. Something like health promotion, so I'd expect that you'll be using this term quite a bit. If it's at the start of the sentence, then it's a capital H and a lowercase p, not both words in capitals. And you can see, for example, in the middle of the sentence, it's always in lowercase and not the other variations there. The other thing that I often see is students misspelling La Trobe. So La Trobe, again, is a proper name. So it's a capital L and a capital T, and it's not La Trobe as one word. So just be mindful of things like your use of capital letters and your proper nouns. The direct quotes, so as I said, your direct quotes are not included in your word count. And should be used sparingly. So for an essay of this size, 1 to 2 short direct quotes is more than enough. And in fact, you really probably shouldn't be using any. And if you are, then really you should only be using them for a definition. Okay. Paraphrasing, we know, makes for much better, much stronger academic writing. And paraphrasing is about taking an idea and putting that idea into your own words. It's not taking slabs of text and just changing a few words. So if you're taking slabs of text and just changing a couple of words, then you will be pulled up for, poor paraphrasing. If you're using lots of quotes, if you're stringing a whole lot of short, direct quotes together, and even if you're only changing one or two words, then you run the risk of not meeting the word limit, and then you get penalised for that. And then you get the comment also that this is not your work, because you haven't actually taken the idea and put it into your own words. And you also run the risk of being referred to the academic integrity advisors for potential academic misconduct as well. So I'd keep quotes to one or two at most, making sure that, of course, that you cite those appropriately. So, in-text citations, using quotation marks, and also that you integrate them into the flow of your sentences so that they're not left hanging. So they need some sort of introduction or some context around them, rather than just having a direct quote as the sentence. Okay. Referencing, so of course, goes without saying you do need to reference this. We are using APA6, and that needs to be used for both your in-text citations and your reference list. Your reference list should only include the sources that you've actually cited in text, and we do check those. Your reference list needs to be presented in alphabetical order, and you shouldn't be changing the ordering of your authors either. So the authors are listed in a particular order for a reason, and actually as authors, there's a lot of consideration that goes into who goes into what order. So in text, you should always present your authors in the order that they appear on the source, and the same in your reference list. One of the questions that I often get asked, and a question probably many of you are thinking about, is how many references? And I feel like I need to ban that question, but it's a question that we get asked a lot. And my answer to this is, how long's a piece of string? There isn't really a set number that's required. We haven't set a minimum, but in saying that this is a third year subject, this is an essay worth 40%, therefore it does require some extensive research and reading and planning. And I think to do a good job of that would require probably no less than 15 good quality sources, to be honest. Which means that in order to get 15 good quality sources to cite, you probably need to be reading a lot more than that. Okay, so if you're writing an essay and you've only got 6 or 7 references, the chances are that you'll get comments on your essays that you haven't fully considered this topic, you haven't provided appropriate evidence to support this work. This reference list is incomplete and not very comprehensive, and then ultimately you'll lose marks for that. So I think that you aiming for somewhere around that 15+ mark to do a really good job of this. Okay. All right. I'll just exit out of this one, and I'll go back to LMS. All right, so I think that really covers at this point the intro, body and conclusion. Does anybody have any questions before we look at the marking rubric? Okay, so Kelsey's just sent me a question. Said, on the tip and guide printout under format, it says we do not need to have a cover page or contents or number of the pages. Is this correct? Yeah, you probably really should have a cover page, and you certainly should include page numbers on your essay. Yeah, you really should be including that. It is kind of standard practice to include a cover page and page numbers. Okay. Does anyone else have questions? No? All right, let's look at the marking guide. All right, so I'll go through this. I won't go through, A, B, C, D, etc. I'll just point out what the expectations are, the things that we're looking for, and talk briefly about the weightings. So the first criteria is around the remote community, which is worth 10% of your mark. So here you should be, as I say, identifying the appropriate remote community. So that's why we're not providing you with a list of communities. You need to source one yourself because there are marks to attach to correctly identifying that. You should be providing contextual evidence about the characteristics of the remote community. So that's what I was saying before, that population data. So how big is the population? What does that population look like? You're doing that breakdown of, maybe age, sex, education, etc., employment, unemployment, those sorts of things, and the location, the services that are available. So what we want to see is that what makes this particular community unique, and using some comparative data to do that. Okay. So a really good essay will provide good quality, contextually relevant evidence, and that it's clearly and concisely articulated about that specific remote community. A good essay will also then compare that to state or national statistics to highlight those key points of uniqueness. So if you're just providing the information solely on that remote community and not really demonstrating how that is similar or different to, say, urban or metro or even rural communities, then you're not going to do as well as somebody who does that comparison. Okay, so that's worth 10%. The health issues that are present in that remote community is worth 15%. So here you need to look at health issues, again, that are specific to that selected community. If it's not available, and sometimes it's not, and we fully recognise that, then you can look at regional data to demonstrate what might be happening within that particular community. Okay, so as I said, these communities sit within larger local government areas, those larger primary health network areas. So you might need to use some of that data if you can't find data specific to the health issues of your chosen remote community. So it just depends on really the size of that community. Eliza, you've got a question? Eliza, did you have a question? No, okay. So as I said, a good essay, so if you're aiming for that A, you want to use locally relevant, provide us with details about locally relevant health issues, that's really well presented. It's supported with good quality evidence and statistics. And so that's where you can draw on things like ABS, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, local government, local health service data. The social discussion on social determinants of health is worth 20%. Okay, so you should be, in terms of word counts, using more words in this section than in those, previous sections, because this is worth more weighting. Okay, so here you need to use evidence to select a range of determinants and health issues relevant to that chosen community. You should be discussing a range of social determinants particular to that remote community. Okay, and as I said, you want to think about determinants in terms of how they are contributing to health both positively and negatively. And as I said before, if your essay is only focused on education or on increasing services, you'll get a low mark for the content because it doesn't demonstrate an understanding of the complexities and the interrelatedness of social determinants. Okay. Okay, so Eliza's just jumped on with the chat. Okay. So Eliza says, just wondering, when comparing rural and urban counterparts, I have chosen a remote community in South Australia and Australia in general. Is this okay, or does this need to be more specific? So Eliza, do you mean that you're looking at that South Australian community and comparing it to broader South Australian data? Because you can do that. So if you've got a remote community in South Australia, you could compare that to South Australia and or Australian. Yep, so you can compare it to state and or national. Either or is fine, okay? And that goes with the health issues as well as some of the determinants as well. All right, there are marks attached to the health promotion and a public health or public health initiative. So you do need to provide us with an overview of that initiative. So the aims, objectives, strategies, and evaluation results, as I said, if that's available. If the evaluation results are not available, you can still provide a critique of that particular program within a public health context. But as I said, you might need to draw on some other similar types of program evaluations to help support that particular discussion. Okay, so that's worth 15 marks. And as I said, we're looking for that internal logic here. So this section needs to be consistent with information that you've presented around determinants and health issues of that community. There's 15 marks attached to your presentation and the logic. So that's that you follow conventional essay format, so good paragraph, sentence and paragraph structure. You shouldn't be using headings or subheadings. This is an essay, not a report. That your introduction and your conclusion follow those conventional expectations. So refer back to that PowerPoint I showed before. I have put that up on LMS in the assessment tab for you. And your conclusion makes a statement about the implications for remoteness on health. So this is where that conclusion will come into, where the marks for that will come into play. And then there's marks for the writing and communication. So that is, your spelling, no spelling, grammatical errors, that your essay is well edited, appropriate style, written in third person, not first person. And 10% for your referencing. So we're looking at, say, appropriate and consistent APA 6 referencing, and that your sources are acknowledged and well integrated to support your points. Okay. Are there any last questions before we wrap up? All right, I'll just point out a couple of things on LMS for you. So can you see the LMS page? Just make sure I've got the right sharing screen. Yep, great. So you'll see that I've put up an example essay. What I have done this morning is I have gone in and I've annotated that. So what you'll be able to see, I've made some comments about things that the student has done in this essay and matching that to the instructions. So for example, you'll see that I've highlighted here in the introduction that the student here is defining remoteness and the classification system. I have noted here that this is an older assignment, that they are referring to ASGC. We're going to be referring to the ASGS, which is just the updated classification system, but it's the same principles that apply. You can see here that they give an explanation of the topic, they introduce the community, and they've linked that to the classification system. So they're getting that internal logic right up front, linking sentences together. And they refer to the determinants of health and introduce the health promotion initiative. Sorry, someone said they can't see. Oh, sorry. Okay, can you see that now? Sorry. So you can see I've gone through and annotated this particular assignment for you. So I've just highlighted things against the instructions and the marking criteria around the strengths of this particular assignment. I just need to say that this is not a perfect assignment. I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfect essay. There's always things that can be done differently and improved upon. But what it does demonstrate is the style and the expectations. I've also this morning downloaded another essay, and I'll do the same thing just to give you another example that you can have a look at, and I'll annotate that and pop that up on LMS for you as well. So if you're a bit unsure about what this should look like, come back and just have a look at these, but bear in mind they're not necessarily perfect, but they are good examples. Okay, so that's one thing that I have put up on LMS. I'll just go back to the LMS site. So the other thing that I have put up is that little PowerPoint that I referred to before, with that diagram around the introduction and conclusion, and the information around referencing and academic writing. So come back and have a look at these. Your essay guide is there. Your submission link is there. So I think you've got lots of information, lots of useful resources. If you've got any further questions, please don't hesitate to post those to the discussion board. So I'm checking that almost daily at the moment, in the lead up to the submission. So you'll get a response within 24 hours or less, except for on weekends. So yeah, please post your questions there. Do check that your question hasn't already been asked and answered, because there's been a bit of sort of activity on that discussion board over the last week. If you've got a question that's more specific to your community or your topic, you can email your facilitator directly and ask questions to them. Just be mindful that they may direct you back to that discussion board if they think that the answer might be useful to other students in the subject as well. If you do need an extension, you can submit that through the formal channels on LMS. You will need supporting documentation with that. And you've got up until sort of 3 business days to submit that, although I do accept them up until the day before your submission. If there are circumstances that happen on the day of submission, or you're late and you think that you might be eligible for special consideration, please contact me and we can have a chat about that, and I can direct you to the appropriate channels for that and support. And if there's any other questions that you have, please, or concerns, please feel free to contact either myself or your facilitator. I hope that's been helpful. It looks like there's one more question. Yep, thank you. Thanks, Kelsey. Kelsey was just saying thanks, that was really helpful. Yeah, as I say, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will be making this recording available on LMS. I don't think I'll get to it today just because I'm in back-to-back meetings for the rest of today, but I'll certainly pop it up first thing tomorrow morning for everybody to have access to, and you can come back and watch it. So I think that's it from me. Good luck, happy researching, happy writing, and I look forward to reading your essays. So thanks, everyone.